morning. Let me also extend my greetings to all of our students, conference participants, and guests, and especially to our partner and host, Hampton University, now known evidently as Hampton by the Sea. Among other forces converging in 1619, the African diaspora stands as one of the most significant. The 17th century witnessed the acceleration of forced African migrations to the Americas and the establishment of many hybrid societies. And this episode was a major part of the historical African diasporas. Fast forward to the 1960s, and we notice the early period of scholarship in the field of African diaspora studies, an area of collective investigation that has helped to redefine the parameters and focus of historical study. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Michael Gomez to our conference. He is one of the pioneers and leading figures in African diaspora studies, and his accomplishments extend to the fields of Middle Eastern and Islamic history. Of particular interest is his focus on the roles of African Muslims in the diaspora. Through his many articles and monographs, Professor Gomez has provided theoretical models and has explored patterns in the movements of African-descended peoples and in their ethnic identities and transitions. As founding president and a director of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, he has promoted international gatherings of scholars from various fields of diaspora studies and has served as a mentor to many of them. From 2009 to 2011, our speaker was president of UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Slave Route Project. Currently, he is also, among other things, series editor of Cambridge Studies on the African Diaspora. His major books, and there are many, include Exchanging Our Country Marks, The Transformation of African Identities in the Colonial and Antebellum South, 1998, and Reversing Sail, A History of the African Diaspora, in 2005. With his doctorate from the University of Chicago, Professor Gomez has chaired history departments at Spelman College and New York University, and is now professor of history and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies at New York University. Let us give him a welcome, and we look forward to his presentation.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm really happy to be at Hampton. This is the first time that I've been on your campus, and I would like to thank Dr. Ruby Alexander and Norfolk State University and Hampton University for your invitation. It's a bit of a homecoming for myself as well, because I spent 9 years teaching at Spelman, and so this is both different and familiar to me. And but that was from 1988 to 97. I think many of you weren't even born in 1990, which is scary to realize. The modern historian, for all of her or his sophistication in the use of quantitative method, theoretical framing, interdisciplinary approaches, data analysis, computer models, and so forth, remains at the end of the day a storyteller, a weaver of narratives, a spinner of tales that hopefully are not the stuff of dreams and fantasy, but rather accounts adhering to rules of evidence dependent on and informed by verifiable fact. We are not free as historians to invent stories or to fabricate reports spun out of the whole or even partial cloth of imagination. Rather, we are relied upon to fashion a rendition of the past that comports with real-world events, like you said, and processes, with what really happened, quote unquote, as a critical framework within which to interpret and contextualize present-day phenomena. That is, in many ways, our readership is taken with our pursuit of history because they seek to connect personally and directly with some aspect of that history in an effort to better understand themselves. Policymakers in conjoined political and economic realms rely upon some notion of history in determining remedies to contemporary challenges. The extent to which they are astute students of the past very much influences the contours of their policies. Religious leaders are nearly wholly dependent upon the telling of the past, as the lives of individuals and collectivities are rehashed over and over again in the attempt to emulate what is good while avoiding error and mistakes. Indeed, history is precisely the point at which the twin verges of policymaking and religion meet in the turbulent confluence known as the Middle East, where competing versions of the past constitute the conceptual terrain over which claims to physical territory are disputed. This and many other examples from any number of land disputes between entities the world over, as well as opposing collective interests in colonial and post-colonial conflicts, represent only a portion of those instances in which the importance and instrumentality of history are on display. Stated differently, history is very much with us. It is ongoing, intersecting with the present in multiple and unavoidable ways. We may wish to ignore the past, to mute it, to dismiss it, but it is difficult to completely disarm it. It carries on somewhere in the collective memory, in the folklore, in the music, in the artwork, in the genes. Those professionally trained to engage with the past therefore play a role in its transmission, and they consequently bear some responsibility for its presentation. In assuming such responsibility, it is important not to be irresponsible. The historian sits before a vast array of information culled from archives and repositories, from interviews with subjects living and dead, from material culture, as well as sonic memory. She is fluent with the historiography of the field, with the ways in which the history of her particular project have been discussed over the years and generations, and mindful of the attendant debates, controversies, and issues awaiting resolution. Animated by an interest in a specific aspect of history, whether it is social, economic, cultural, or political, and armed with a particular perspective, informed by one or more theoretical framings of history, she begins to sift through the data. The objective is to create a coherent narrative informed by all of the above, and to do so in a manner as creative and innovative as possible, so as to make a contribution, to say something new about something old, to enter into the historiography in a fresh and meaningful way. To accomplish this, she must arrive at a central thesis. She must make a claim that has not been made before, after which she must marshal materials to support that claim. This is the craft of the historian. This is what we do. And in so doing, it is not possible that we completely avoid bringing to the writing of history something of ourselves. As opposed to a computer, the historian is a human being who participates in all facets of society, including the public square. As is true of the physician, the judge, the police officer, and the preacher, he has political views and a set of mores, and often feels very strongly about them. He has been affected by the experiences in life and is embedded in a set of social relations. So as he sifts through his his array of data, mindful of the historiography and guided by his theoretical suppositions, as he begins to weave his own account of the past, he also brings to the work his personal experiences, political views, religious beliefs and values. And all of these factors converge to influence the production of the work. From what factual evidence is included to what is sublimated or completely ignored, to the argument itself, from the tone and phrasing to its very substance. We would like to think that the historian is above all of this, that by virtue of his training and commitment to rigor and impartiality, he is impervious to the social and political circumstances of his personal life. But this is neither a logical nor productive set of assumptions. Just as the physician, the police officer, the judge, the statesman, and the preacher are all human beings whose professional performances can be influenced by views and experience derivative from the realm of the personal, The same holds true for the historian. This is not an altogether ruinous condition, but in fact is part of what makes history and its writing so invigorating and enlivening. That is, when reading any work, it is critical to be able to identify not only the theoretical perspective, but also the ideological underpinning that in many instances bears some relationship to the totality of the author's experience. This does not necessarily diminish the author as a scholar, nor does it necessarily impugn her integrity unless oversights and mischaracterizations are willful. Nowhere is this more problematic than with the challenge of writing a history of the Americas, or Europe for that matter, that is significantly inclusive of Africa, wherein Africa and Africans feature and are more than simply scaffolding or props or points in a primordial past, after which, a la Hegel, they are no more to be mentioned. Socialization in Western cultures is all about valorizations that meet the needs of the state and or promote consumerism. And in both instances, knowledge of Africa is hardly relevant and commonly viewed as totally extraneous. We attend primary and secondary schools in which, other than the birthplace of human beings, Africa is rarely mentioned. Quotidian news cycles frequently mention Africa in conjunction with plagues of one sort or another, pandemic disease, drought and famine, natural disasters, exacerbated by seemingly incessant war, political instability, and intractable impoverishment. Hollywood, an industry that during world wars and Cold War systematically produced propaganda feeding nationalism and the vaulted Western self-image as both conqueror and civilizer, formerly generated films such as Tarzan, but more recent depictions of the continent rarely diverge from the use of similar tropes. This is our collective, consistent picture of Africa, and we bring that picture into the university, where it is rarely dislodged or even questioned, and from there into the offices and boardrooms and civil courts of decision makers throughout the land, whose decisions, against the backdrop of pure fantasy and misinformation, affect very real Africans and their descendants. The historian of the Americas or Europe, therefore, has at least two options. She can either accept the popular narrative about Africa and reflect that narrative through her teaching and scholarship via caricature repetition, or she can ignore the continent and its people altogether, which in the end comes down to the same thing. For those in either category, the remainder of my remarks this morning have no relevance. But for those who have some interest in addressing these issues, there is hope, though the way is strewn with obstacles and is by no means clear. Let's consider the hazards. A logical approach is to adopt classroom texts that seem to incorporate significant and useful discussion of Africa. And this would be particularly important for those teaching world history, world culture courses, world civilization courses, and the like. Such texts exist, though they are very hard to find, and even when found, they cannot serve as the sole base for what we know about Africa. Synthetic works are just that, and require that we look to at least some of the monographic materials in support. It is not clear to me that the authors of synthetic texts actually read those monographs, as they are usually far removed from the study of Africa and rely on the recommendations of Africanists to generate their bibliographies, while they themselves actually only peruse existing syntheses, which they then paraphrase. The references tell the tale, with dated and conventional works often cited. So it is important to go beyond the textbook and actually read at least some of the monographs themselves. This is especially true for Americanists, whose spatial and temporal sites of inquiry are often filled with Africans and their descendants. But in turning to the monographs of the Africanists, a necessary yet laudable approach given the context, one must be aware that the historiographic terrain is laden with minefields of all sorts, and that, as is true of any other field, there are a number of controversies and debates ongoing and unresolved in the literature. As I read the most recent publications on Africa over the last 10 years, they tend to be infused with a certain meta-language and conceptual lingua franca that establishes the terms of the debate by creating a new sequence of concerns and problems in the name of raising new questions, while employing terminology and turns of phrase that have become so sufficiently ingrained as to become nearly conventional, with little or no interrogation of the circumstances out of which these new set of problematics have arisen. Most of the Africanist historical literature is focused on the colonial and post-colonial term, which is readily understandable in that it bears directly upon contemporary issues and also allows Africanists to engage with the scholarship concerned with similar phenomena elsewhere, especially in the Indian subcontinent. Before exploring some of these issues, however, consideration of antecedent historiographic trends will aid us in better understanding the new positioning of the most recent trends. To be sure, Western scholarly writing on Africa goes back to at least the 19th century, and in the Anglophone world was largely led by such early Pan-Africanists as Martin Delany, Henry Highland Garnet, and Edward Blyth. These visionaries had a vested interest in Africa as a motherland or fatherland to which the enslaved and formerly enslaved should aspire to return. Some of these individuals spent significant time in Africa recording their impressions while writing articles that remain useful and highly instructive. Their interests and line of reasoning were adopted by such subsequent titans as W.B. Du Bois, who during an amazingly long and productive life and career developed as a principal objective the placing of the African continent within a global context as a source, if not the very font of civilization, with emphases on antiquity as well as early and medieval cultures and societies in West and East Africa. The work of Du Bois is exemplary, given the period in which he worked and his limited resources. But what is more instructive about Du Bois is that while very aware of both the transatlantic trade in human beings as well as the subsequent dawn of colonialism, and as one of the latter's harshest critics, he sought to relocate the view and valuation of the African from one of deprivation and disrespect to one by which the African was placed on equal footing with counterparts in both Europe and Asia. But while Du Bois, as activist and scholar, was well known within many circles, his work for the most part was rejected and ignored by the established academy. In any event, the study of Africa was becoming professionalized, quote unquote, primarily through the establishment of colonialism's stepchild, anthropology, and was therefore a process centered in Europe. The earliest scholarly works of the late 19th through mid-20th centuries are intimately associated with the colonial project. Indeed, many of the works were penned by colonial officers, all for the purpose of acquiring knowledge in order to facilitate empire. But what we should never lose sight of is the fact that in the acquisition of knowledge, these early ethnographers did not simply record, but they also invented a number of concepts that became accepted as African, quote unquote, such as notions of customary law, the expansion or restriction of political authority, and the rise of whole new ethnicities. Of course, the metropoles were simultaneously creating nations with arbitrary and, in too many instances, nonsensical borders that continue to bedevil African politics and society. It was against this backdrop, wherein notions of backward tribes and atavistic cultures were deeply embedded, and for which the only remedy was seen to be some form of civilizing mission, that the so-called nationalist period of Africanist historiography emerged. Writing in the 1960s and 70s, both Western and African scholars wrote in modes that emphasized African capacity and promise, and tended to focus on states and empires of the African past as emblematic of what was to come. These were scholars writing in the heat of anti-colonial struggles, with a number of African states achieving independence through one mechanism or another. Their efforts were in lockstep with those in Asia and the Caribbean. and while also corresponding to the struggle for human rights and dignity in the United States. It was a hopeful period, a heady time, in which scholars from all disciplines and walks of life endeavored to employ their various trainings to construct a new Africa, to chart a new direction in the continent's struggles. The hopes and dreams of the 1960s and 70s, however, soon collided with the realities and machinations of the late 1970s and 80s, with Western orchestrated imprisonment, assassination, and exile of visionary leaders throughout the continent, replaced by chosen henchmen who would remain in power for decades, bleeding their countries dry, by shifting economic fortunes in which prices for primary goods and commodities fell precipitously, while oil prices increased exponentially, by politics thoroughly royal through unrealistic expectations of creating states from populations with little or no historical relationship to one another, or who were often hostile to each other, by corrupt and inept leaders who thieved the wealth and patrimony of their constituencies, all with the complete knowledge and support of their Western donors, who themselves benefited by loans offered at outrageously and unconscionably exorbitant rates of interest, by an international business community steadfastly refusing to invest in the productive capacities of the continent, relying instead on extractive industries while relocating manufacturing to Asia and Latin America. Recipes for utter failure. These measures would be followed by the IMF and World Bank in the 1990s, and their prescriptions for cleaning up a mess for which the West was arguably largely responsible. Their structural adjustment programs, which essentially call for the gutting of human services and cessation of subsidizing currencies in the belief that the free market would magically resolve all of Africa's woes, only met with predictably increasing social distress and frustration. The void left by the West is now being filled by China, whereby China is given almost limitless access to land and resources in exchange for infrastructural projects and the like. But the basic formula whereby Africa exports raw materials for someone else's finished products, and where investment in the productive capacities of African people is rarely made, this continues on. In the face of the disappointments of the 1970s and 80s, something commonly referred to as Afro-pessimism began to creep into the writings of the scholarly community. Some with the best of intentions began to lament Africa's seemingly intractable woes and began to rethink the causes. This was also during a period in which so-called dependency theory or world systems theory, in which the problems of the developing world were laid squarely at the feet of the industrialized nations, began to undergo withering assault. As a consequence, rather than externalizing Africa's problems, more and more political scientists and sociologists began to fault Africa and Africans for most of their difficulties, concluding that, notwithstanding their historical difficulties with the transatlantic trade and colonialism, Africans had simply squandered their opportunities, gambling away their future by betting on high-risk socialist experimentation. Historians of Africa, taking note of the discussion in the political and economic realms, began to reflect this changing perspective and emphasis in their own work. We cannot overlook the irony, or perhaps even the hypocrisy, of those historians who critique the so-called nationalist scholarship of the 1960s and 70s as being very much an outgrowth of the desire and struggle to achieve independence, thereby prejudicing the history itself, when these same historians cannot see how they are just as impacted by the politics of their own day, by the failure of the Soviet Union and triumph of global capitalism, by the move to the right of much of the politics in both the United States and Europe, fueled by faltering economies and immigration issues, and how the fight against so-called radical Islam has put the squeeze on resources, thereby begging the question of who precisely is deserving of such resources, such that our current politics is driven to a large degree by the need to identify and define core constituencies. That is, who are the real Americans, the real British, the real Germans, against all other pretenders. It has become insufferable, quite frankly, to listen to scholars disingenuously hold forth about the agendas and romanticism of the nationalists and Pan-Africanists, as if they are immune from influence, as if they do not have their own agendas, as if they do not suffer themselves from a view of Africa that is in fact part fantasy. And so it is that more recent African scholarship takes contemporary problems and concerns and historicizes them, quote unquote, by locating their origin in some antecedent time before the present. Enough of the literature takes direct aim at Africa and Africans and resituates causality within the continent as opposed to outside of it. As the trade in African captives and colonial rule are facts around which it is difficult to maneuver, this approach does not deny European involvement, as it cannot. But in the name of escaping such expended categories as those of victimization and dependency, recent trends in the scholarship instead call for re-envisioning an African past in which decisions and regimes of oppression were co-authored, jointly developed. In this way, and in the cause to restore agency, quote unquote, to Africans, the latter, that is the African, is depicted as fully participatory in not only the slave trade, but in colonialism itself. What has become prominent in the collective literature is the use of such concepts as entanglement, contingency, malleability, interdependency, negotiation, accommodation, wherein Africans emerge as veritable equal players in processes that are ultimately not in their interest. In the name of all that is we'll skip that. In response to developments, it goes too far. In response to developments in the Africanist literature, the scholarship on the African diaspora, on the Atlantic world, and in slavery studies all have examples that follow suit. To some extent, this is a consequence of the fact that it is Africanists who are writing some of the Atlantic materials. But there are other non-Africanists who read what Africanists write, wittingly or not, and adopt their positions with respect to questions involving the history and experiences of the African descendant in the Americas. As such, the literature on the Americas begins with the premise that Africans were fully participatory in the transatlantic slave trade, and begins to weave tales whose effect is to argue that although enslaved and otherwise oppressed, the African descendant had substantial, if not enormous, say over the circumstances of their lives. The entanglement, contingency, malleability of the African lexicon is replaced in the Americanist literature with such concepts as nuance and reverse agency and collaboration and indeterminacy and so on. But the vocabulary employed on both sides of the pond is pretty much the same. This is not to say that these concepts have no validity. Rather, it is to say that we participate in a culture of euphemisms, wherein we learn to say what we really want to say in less offensive and more diplomatic ways. It makes sense that historical relationships ensued in which there were elements of contingency, accommodation, and agency. But we do violence to the historical reality or set of realities when we employ these euphemisms to mean that there were equivalencies between those empowered and those disempowered, such that power and privilege were entirely the consequence of negotiation between equals. This applies especially to the transatlantic trade in human beings, where a strong case has been made that Europeans and Africans were equal commercial partners. They were not equal partners. They were not equal in seafaring experience, capitalizing the slaving venture, or controlling the terms of the trade, and they certainly were not equals with respect to the trade's benefits. The illustrious Thomas Jefferson himself understood this principle well. In a discussion with the French ambassador in 1801 concerning how to respond to Haiti, he stated, quote, "As long as we don't allow the blacks to possess a ship, we can allow them to exist and even maintain very lucrative commercial contacts with them," unquote. Emphases that envision slaving and colonialism as partnerships are also misleading, as they imply processes of reciprocity in matters cultural and social. While this makes some sense for the Americas, it was hardly the case in Africa, which constituted the sphere of activity or domain of interaction where Europeans were relatively few in number. We also need to rethink our investment in all of these matters with respect to the slave trade. And here we are in need of global history's intervention. For although colonialism is in much of the African mainland may not have begun until the late 19th century, colonialism as a specific form of European expansionism began as early as the 15th centuries in the islands of Madeira and Sao Tome, in the 16th century through the Americas, East African littoral, segments of the Indian Ocean, early 17th century in Southern Africa, and so forth. In other words, though it could not have been predicted with precision that colonialism would take hold of the entire continent, colonialism as a globally transgressive force had clearly been unleashed some 400 years before the 1884-85 Berlin Conference. So that while the specificity of domination may have been uncertain, I question this notion that the domination itself was in doubt, or in any way unavoidable. Or in any way avoidable. So the historian of the Americas, looking to improve his knowledge of Africa, needs to understand that, as is true of any field, there are differences of interpretation and emphasis. And one of the areas that I believe is key to our understanding the intersection of Africa and the Americas is the question of the African herself, and whether she is depicted and treated as a whole person, or simply a slave. And it is from the latter characterization that we must create some distance, embracing the former. In the effort to address this issue, Americanists seem to fall into three camps. The first consists of those who make no effort whatsoever at understanding the cultural, social, and political context out of which the enslaved were extracted. And in their writings, some of which remain very influential, the African does not emerge with much inhumanity at all, but rather is treated like an insignificant cog in a much larger, more important wheel, their very presence begrudgingly acknowledged. I have no hope for this category. At the other end of the spectrum are those who take the question of African culture and society seriously and attempt to understand the enslaved as whole persons, in the same way that they understand the Irish and the Germans and the Dutch and the English. Of this group I am enamored. But then there's a third group, an interstitial group, a consortium that resides between these polarities, who have developed a different approach. These scholars have fashioned a third way of viewing the enslaved population that draws heavily from earlier anthropological models, placing the accent on what develops as a consequence of North-South interaction as opposed to what precedes it. These creolization theorists hold that all along the Atlantic littoral, and in particular West Africa, there emerged communities who, as a consequence of European-African interaction, were multiracial and or multicultural, communities who invariably spoke Portuguese and French and English, and that these communities formed a charter or foundational generation from which subsequent enslaved populations were produced. Ipso facto, the African cultural and social component of these charter generations is far less important than the mix that results. But the unavoidable inference here is that you can ignore what is African and focus instead on what is essentially European, thereby allowing you to remain in your comfort zone. While the Creolists make an interesting point in that they push creolization back to Africa itself as opposed to the Americas, I find the effort rather dubious, because multicultural communities were very small in number and tended to be concentrated at the ports. They probably had little interaction with captives coming from the hinterland and were often themselves selling captives. Even in West Central Africa, in Congo, Angola, where there was the greatest degree of Euro-African intermixing, many, if not the vast majority of those captured and who had some degree of Portuguese were steeped in Congolese culture and religion, so that you have to know something about the latter to understand who they were. The focus on African Creoles is interesting, but hardly representative of most Africans who wound up in the Americas. Here I get into another argument with scholars, and we're running out of time. So I'm going to get to my conclusion. In revising our curricula for the Americas then, and in making more capacious our individual research agendas, let us become more mindful of the ways in which our current renderings of geopolitics and culture often continue to exclude and include. We can be more innovative in our teaching, offering more transnational forces that place into conversation populations and ideas that normally are kept separate and viewed as distinct. We can do the same with respect to publications, and in both journals and edited volumes, bring together scholarship that is not just transnational, but transcultural as well. In discussing slavery, let us endeavor to present the enslaved as full human beings, and to bestow upon them the dignity so long denied. In discussing the age of revolution, let us include Haiti as not simply a high-end slave revolt, but as a veritable revolution itself, arguably one of the boldest attempts at fundamental political and social change this hemisphere has ever witnessed. And if one insists on featuring the French Revolution, is it not fair to interrogate the basis for the emergence of the Third Estate, and to ask from where did the wealth of the merchant classes of Bordeaux and Nantes come, if not principally from the sugarcane fields of Saint-Domingue? In presenting Simón Bolívar as the great liberator of South America, let us not forget that the backbone of his troops were Afrodescendientes, they were black people, and that in his darkest hour, it was upon Haiti that he relied, and from whom he received sustenance and support, something he conveniently forgot in his hour of triumph. And in the midst of all the repression and bigotry, we need to remember how those of African descent gave their all to the extent allowed in world wars. This obviously applies not only to places like the United States, but also to Europe, where African participation in World War was extraordinary, and where la resistance under de Gaulle in the 20th century, like Bolivar in the 19th, was veritably saved by African troops prior to his whitening. That is the process, that is to say, he replaced Africans with Europeans in the winter of 1944-45, after the Allies had defeated the Germans at Normandy. And de Gaulle wanted only white troops to lead the triumphal return to Paris through the Champs-Élysées. Time fails us here, but there are many, many opportunities to incorporate Africans into these histories. It's not a matter of political correctness, but rather one of accuracy. It's about telling the truth. In concluding my remarks, I return to the theme of Africa in an ongoing effort to place it at the center of analysis. There was a time when there was no such thing as African history. It was a contradiction in terms. As the field developed, we learned much more about Europeans in Africa than about Africans themselves, and that from a decidedly Orientalist gaze. It was at that moment, precisely during the 1960s and 70s, when the call went forth to find or recover African voices and perspectives to at least help balance the scale. But given the most recent wave of African scholarship, we seem to have arrived at a very different place, where the prior call to include the African voice is now seen as anachronistic, if not even racist. There was once a time when the scholarship was complicit in the colonial project, where the scholar and the colonizer were the same person. Where we are now is not clear to me, but what is clear is a growing gap in opportunities and funding between scholars based in Africa and those working outside of it, and this can only impoverish our collective work. This does not bode well for the future. Those who come to the study of Africa from outside of the continent do so for a variety of reasons, of course. My own position is to welcome all with an interest in Africa, asking only that they come with an open mind while examining their own preoccupations and assumptions. Equally, we need to re-examine our assumptions about Western civilization. The African may not have been in every place, but she was in a lot of them. He may not have made a direct contribution to every endeavor under the sun, but where he did, it should be acknowledged. He may not have been visible in Versailles in 1789, but the labor he produced in the cane field of Saint-Domingue helps explain the accumulation of wealth that made the 1789 gathering of the Estates General at Versailles such a critical turn in human history. Indeed, his labor helps to explain the grandeur of Versailles itself, along with the glory of France. The challenge of finally giving the African his due, ladies and gentlemen, is both our challenge and hope. Thank you very much.
I think you see now why this field of African diaspora studies is so exciting, and why Professor Gomez is one of the leading scholars, one of the pioneers. I hope that all the students understand, too, how important it is to raise questions from every perspective when you're dealing with something as complicated as this episode. We have time for a couple of questions before we have to transition to the round table. Do we have questions? I know it's a lot to digest from what he said.
So, as I understood the question, it is this difficulty we're having with funding scholarship, the scholarship of those who are located, situated in Africa itself. That is this to some extent a function of some antipathy on the part of Western-based scholars. I've restated the question. I think that it boils down primarily to the fragile state of economies in various African states. And invariably, when a state is in crisis, one of the first things that goes is investment in education, especially university and so forth. So it's a very difficult, very difficult situation. And yeah, I have a number of friends who are now located in the States or Canada because they could not, for a number of reasons, could not continue on in the continent. On the other hand, I do have friends who have returned to various places to pursue their scholarship. So, but it's the fragility of the economies, I think, primarily explains the situation. But that then becomes a real difficult set of circumstances, because if the focus of the study of the African continent shifts to the West, we've got some issues, okay? Because then what happens is that well, there's some political things that come with that, and I don't have time to talk about it, but there's some problems with it.
I have a question right here from this gentleman.
Yes.
Go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
There's a mic right there by you.
Hello?
Yes.
All this is great information. However, I want to ask you, when do you think that this information will be able to reach the kids? Because I'm working in classrooms and I'm seeing the textbooks and it's saying something entirely different.
From what I just said.
Yeah, and basically, like, how long do you think that's going to be able to happen?
Well, you know what? That's an excellent question. It's an important question, and I agree with you. I mean, in a fundamental way, that's where the rubber meets the road. And what we really need, I mean, you have individuals who are attempting to develop textbooks for primary and secondary school levels. These individuals tend to work as lone scholars. You know, they're out there on their own trying to find the necessary amount of resources to fund their work and so forth. It's a very difficult thing. What we need really is a serious investment of money and support, whereby educators who are committed to primary and secondary school education can begin to collaborate with researchers to jointly come together with texts that can be used at these levels. What I can say to you is that this has been discussed. I'm aware of this. It's been discussed, not just for the United States, not just for the United States. For example, in Brazil, there's a law on the books which require the teaching of Afro-Brazilian history. So it's a law, and so consequently there have been a number of lone authors who have rushed to fill in to meet this gap. And a lot of the literature is really awful. And so there needs to be a collaboration. And this is a long-term project, but I fully agree with you that this is the direction in which we need to take it. Yes.